I'm the last employee at an abandoned water park. The pools are full of things that shouldn't exist. The summer I started working at Neptune's Kingdom, I was 17 and thought I had the world figured out. The pay was decent for a teenager, and the job came with perks most kids my age could only dream about. Free access to all the rides during break times, discounted food from the concession stands, and best of all, plenty of opportunities to meet girls who looked incredible in swimsuits. I worked the ticket booth mostly, but sometimes they'd rotate me to different stations around the park depending on what needed coverage. That's how I met Rebecca Chen, who ran the funnel cake stand near the Thunder Rapids ride. She had this laugh that could cut through the noise of screaming kids and rushing water, and when she smiled, her whole face lit up like she'd just heard the best joke in the world. Rebecca and I would sneak away during slow periods to share cigarettes behind the maintenance sheds where nobody could see us breaking the no-smoking policy. The best spot was underneath the wooden supports of the Kraken's Revenge, the park's biggest roller coaster that sent riders plunging through a series of water-filled tubes at speeds that probably weren't entirely safe. We'd sit there on old milk crates, listening to the screams of riders overhead while water dripped down on us from the track above. Rebecca thought it was hilarious when the droplets would extinguish our cigarettes mid-puff. She'd laugh and light another one immediately, as if the universe interrupting our rebellion was the funniest thing she'd ever experienced. I can still remember the way her fingers smelled when I kissed them goodbye each night, a mixture of funnel cake batter and menthol cigarettes that somehow became the most intoxicating scent in the world. The park was massive, sprawling across nearly 40 acres of what used to be farmland before some developer decided northern Michigan needed a world-class water park. Neptune's Kingdom had everything you could want. Traditional water slides that sent you racing down into splash pools, a lazy river that meandered around the entire property, kiddie areas with miniature versions of the adult rides, and the crown jewel, Poseidon's Plunge, a nearly vertical drop slide that scared even the most fearless teenagers. During peak season, we'd see upwards of 3,000 visitors per day, all of them eager to escape the summer heat in our chlorinated paradise. The parking lot would fill up by 10 in the morning, and by noon, you could barely move through the crowds of families hauling coolers and beach bags toward the entrance gates. But even during those busy summers, there were signs that something wasn't quite right about Neptune's Kingdom. The accident rate was higher than industry standards, though management always attributed this to the aggressive nature of our rides and the fact that people didn't follow safety instructions. At least once a week, we'd have to shut down a section of the park while EMTs wheeled someone out on a stretcher. Broken bones were common, usually from people hitting the sides of slides wrong or landing badly in the splash pools. But we also had our share of more serious incidents that left everyone shaken. Concussions from riders hitting their heads on tunnel ceilings, lacerations from broken tiles that somehow appeared overnight, and a disturbing number of near-drowning incidents in pools that were supposed to be shallow enough for children to stand in comfortably. The strangest thing was how equipment would malfunction for no apparent reason. Rides that had been inspected and certified as safe would suddenly develop problems that our maintenance crew couldn't explain. Pumps would stop working in the middle of busy periods, leaving pools stagnant and unusable. Control panels would short out during thunderstorms, even when they were supposed to be weather-resistant. Most unsettling of all, the water chemistry would sometimes change overnight, transforming crystal-clear pools into murky, algae-filled swamps that took days of chemical treatment to restore. Our head of maintenance, a grizzled veteran named Frank Morrison, who'd been working water parks for 30 years, would shake his head and mutter about equipment that seemed to have a mind of its own. Rebecca and I dated through that entire first summer, and by the time Labor Day weekend rolled around, I was head over heels in love with her in the way only 17-year-olds can manage. We talked about staying together when she left for college, maybe even getting engaged after I graduated high school. But like most teenage romances, ours didn't survive the reality of distance and different life paths. She headed off to study business at Michigan State, and I finished my senior year working part-time at a local grocery store, counting down the days until Neptune's Kingdom would reopen, and I could return to the place where I'd been happiest. By the time summer came around again, Rebecca had found someone new, and I was left with memories of funnel cake and menthol cigarettes that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The second summer was different. I was 18 now, officially an adult, which meant I could work full-time and take on more responsibilities around the park. They promoted me to shift supervisor, which meant I was in charge of a handful of other teenage employees and got to carry one of those important-looking walkie-talkies that made me feel like I was running the place. But with the promotion came exposure to things I'd never noticed as a regular employee. The incident reports that management tried to keep quiet, the insurance investigators who showed up unannounced to examine accident sites, and the increasingly frequent visits from state safety inspectors who seemed genuinely concerned about our accident statistics. The pool incidents were getting worse and more frequent. What used to be isolated problems were becoming daily occurrences that threatened to shut us down entirely. The Mermaid Lagoon, our main swimming area, developed an algae problem that resisted every chemical treatment we tried. The water would clear up for a day or two, then return to an unsettling green color that reminded me of pond scum. Kids who swam in it would develop rashes that took weeks to heal, and a few parents threatened lawsuits before management finally closed the area indefinitely. But closing sections of the park meant overcrowding in the remaining areas, which led to more accidents and injuries as people pushed the limits of rides that were already operating beyond safe capacity. Frank Morrison started acting strange during my second summer. He'd always been a bit eccentric, the kind of guy who talked to machinery like it could understand him, but now he seemed genuinely afraid of certain areas of the park. He'd refuse to go near the deep-end pools after sunset, claiming he could hear things moving in the water that shouldn't be there. When pressed for details, he'd just shake his head and mutter about 30 years in the business and never seeing anything anything like what was happening at Neptune's kingdom. Other employees started avoiding him, convinced he was either drinking on the job or suffering from some kind of mental breakdown brought on by stress. The first time I saw something that couldn't be explained away as equipment malfunction or human error was during a late-night maintenance shift in July. I was working with Jake Rodriguez, another supervisor who'd been at the park for 3 years, checking the chemical levels in all the major pools before opening the next morning. It was tedious work that required testing pH levels, chlorine content, and overall water clarity at dozens of different locations throughout the park. We'd developed a routine where Jake would handle the testing while I recorded the numbers and adjusted chemical dispensers as needed. We were about halfway through our rounds when Jake called out from the deep end of Poseidon's pool, the massive collection basin for our biggest water slide. His voice sounded strange, higher pitched than normal, with an edge of panic that made me drop my clipboard and run over to see what was wrong. Jake was standing at the edge of the pool, shining his flashlight down into the water with a look of absolute terror on his face. When I asked what he was seeing, he just pointed into the depths and whispered that something had grabbed his testing equipment and pulled it down into the darkness. I looked where he was pointing and saw his pool skimmer disappearing into water that should have been only 8 feet deep at its maximum. But the skimmer kept sinking, its outline visible through the clear water for what seemed like impossible distances before finally vanishing entirely into blackness that extended far beyond the physical dimensions of the pool. Jake quit the next morning without giving any explanation to management beyond claiming he'd found better opportunities elsewhere. I tried to convince myself that what we'd witnessed was some kind of optical illusion, maybe caused by underwater lighting that created false depth perception in the darkness. But over the following weeks, I started paying closer attention to things I'd previously ignored. The way some pools seemed deeper during certain times of day, as if their dimensions changed when nobody was looking. The sounds that came from drain grates late at night, like something large moving through pipes that were supposed to be too small to accommodate anything bigger than debris and leaves. Most disturbing of all, the occasional glimpses of movement in peripheral vision, shapes that seemed to dart just beyond the reach of our floodlights whenever I worked the night maintenance shifts. By the end of that second summer, Neptune's kingdom was bleeding money from lawsuits and insurance claims. The local news had picked up on our safety problems, running investigative pieces about the unusually high accident rate and questioning whether the park should be allowed to continue operating. Attendance dropped by nearly 60% as word spread about the dangers lurking beneath our fun-filled exterior. Management tried everything they could think of to restore public confidence, hiring additional safety personnel, implementing new protocols for ride operation, even bringing in consultants from other successful water parks to identify problems and recommend solutions. But nothing seemed to work, and by Labor Day weekend, everyone knew that Neptune's kingdom was living on borrowed time. The announcement came in October, delivered by our general manager to a group of year-round employees that had shrunk to less than a dozen people. Neptune's kingdom would not reopen for the following summer. The combination of legal liability, insurance costs, and declining revenue had made continued operation financially impossible. Most of the seasonal staff had already moved on to other jobs or returned to school. But those of us who'd been hoping for long-term employment were suddenly facing unemployment in a small town with limited opportunities. The manager offered me a position with the skeleton crew that would maintain the property through the winter while they attempted to find a buyer, and with no other prospects on the horizon, I accepted what I thought would be a temporary assignment. That first winter alone at Neptune's kingdom was like living in a post-apocalyptic wasteland designed by someone with a cruel sense of humor. The rides stood silent and motionless, their bright colors faded and garish under the gray Michigan sky. Heavy tarps covered all the pools, creating a landscape of uneven blue and green shapes that shifted and rustled in the winter wind like the breathing of enormous sleeping animals. During the day, the emptiness was merely depressing, a reminder of all the joy and excitement that had once filled these spaces. But at night, when the security lights cast long shadows between the abandoned attractions, the park transformed into something genuinely frightening that seemed to watch me with malevolent intent. My responsibilities were minimal during those winter months. Walk the perimeter twice daily to check for vandalism or break-ins. Test the heating systems in buildings that needed to be kept above freezing to prevent pipe damage. Make sure the chemical treatment systems continued running in the covered pools to prevent the growth of bacteria and algae that could contaminate the water beyond salvage. Most of the actual maintenance work was handled by outside contractors who would arrive during regular business hours, complete their assigned tasks, and leave as quickly as possible. I got the impression they didn't like being at the park any more than necessary, though none of them would explain why they seemed so eager to finish their work and get back on the road. The first incident that winter happened in December, during one of the heavy snowstorms that regularly buried northern Michigan under several feet of powder. I was making my evening rounds when I heard music coming from the direction of the kiddie area, a tinkling melody that sounded like the soundtrack from one of the small rides designed for children under 10. But all the electrical systems in that section of the park had been shut down weeks earlier to save on utility costs during the closure. I followed the sound through the falling snow, my flashlight beam dancing ahead of me as I tried to locate the source of the mysterious music. The melody was coming from the Seahorse Carousel, a gentle ride that rotated small fiberglass seahorses around a central hub while playing cheerful songs designed to delight toddlers. But the ride wasn't just playing music, it was actually operating, the seahorses bobbing up and down in their slow, hypnotic cycle, while colored lights flashed in patterns that should have been controlled by a computer system that had been disconnected months earlier. I stood there in the falling snow, watching this impossible scene and trying to come up with a rational explanation for what I was witnessing. Maybe the electrical shutdown shutdown hadn't been as complete as I'd been told. Maybe some backup system had activated due to the cold weather. But when I checked the electrical panel for that section of the park, every breaker was in the off position, and the main power cable showed no signs of current when I tested it with a voltmeter. The Seahorse carousel was operating without any electrical power source that I could identify, drawing energy from some mechanism that existed outside my understanding of how carnival rides functioned. I watched it continue its slow rotation for nearly an hour, the cheerful music echoing across the empty park while snow accumulated on the motionless figures of the seahorses. Eventually, the ride simply stopped on its own, the music fading away into the winter silence as if someone had reached over and turned off a switch I couldn't see. Word of the winter incidents eventually reached the insurance company that had been trying to settle the remaining lawsuits from Neptune's kingdom's final summer. They sent investigators to examine the property and determine whether the reported phenomena posed any additional liability concerns. I was interviewed extensively about my experiences during the closure period, though I got the impression the investigators were more interested in determining my mental state than documenting actual supernatural occurrences. They seemed convinced that the isolation and stress of guarding an abandoned amusement park had caused me to experience hallucinations or delusions that I was interpreting as paranormal activity. But the investigators' skepticism evaporated when they witnessed an incident firsthand during their 3-day site inspection. On their final evening at the park, we were conducting a comprehensive examination of the main pool complex when one of the heavy tarps covering Poseidon's pool began moving in ways that couldn't be explained by wind or changes in air pressure. The plastic sheet was rising and falling in rhythmic patterns, as if something large was swimming beneath it in water that should have been treated with enough chemicals to kill anything larger than bacteria. When we pulled back the tarp to investigate, the pool appeared normal at first glance, filled with clear water that reflected our flashlight beams back at perfect angles. But as we watched, the water began to churn and bubble as if something massive was moving through it at high speed. Waves appeared and spread across the surface, creating patterns that suggested the presence of multiple large objects moving in coordinated fashion beneath the surface. One investigator attempted to take water samples for analysis, but his equipment was yanked from his hands and pulled down into depths that seemed to extend far beyond the physical dimensions of the pool. Within minutes, all 3 investigators had packed their equipment and were heading for their vehicles with expressions of barely controlled panic on their faces. They filed a report recommending immediate demolition of the entire facility, citing unspecified safety hazards that posed unacceptable risks to anyone who might attempt to renovate or reopen the property. The demolition never happened. Whatever government agency had been funding the investigators apparently decided that the cost of tearing down Neptune's kingdom exceeded the potential benefits of eliminating the hazards it contained. Instead, they classified the property as a contaminated site requiring ongoing monitoring and assigned me a permanent position as site caretaker with benefits and salary that far exceeded anything I could have earned elsewhere. My job description was deliberately vague, requiring only that I maintain minimal security and report any significant changes in site conditions to a phone number that connected me to an automated system that seemed to record my messages but never provided any human response. The years began blending together after that decision. Spring would arrive, and I'd spend weeks preparing the park for a reopening that never came. Summer would pass with me walking empty pathways between silent rides, while grass grew through cracks in the concrete and paint peeled from surfaces that had once been maintained with obsessive care. Fall would bring its own maintenance challenges as leaves clogged drainage systems, and winter weather preparation became my primary focus. And winter would return, bringing with it the incidents that had become so common I barely bothered reporting them anymore, unless they posed direct threats to my safety or the structural integrity of the park's infrastructure. The pools were changing, evolving into something that bore only superficial resemblance to the recreational water features they'd once been. The chemical treatment systems had long since been overwhelmed by whatever was growing in the water, and the bright blue surfaces had transformed into dark, murky environments that reminded me more of natural ponds than artificial swimming areas. Strange algae formations created patterns on the surface that seemed almost deliberate, geometric designs that would appear overnight and persist for weeks before shifting into new configurations. The smell of chlorine had been replaced by an organic scent that reminded me of ocean tide pools during low tide, briny and rich with the smell of things that lived and died in salt water. Frank Morrison had been right to be afraid of the deep-end pools. Whatever lived in those waters now was large, intelligent, and completely uninterested in maintaining the peaceful coexistence that had characterized the early years of my caretaking duties. During my evening security rounds, I would sometimes hear sounds coming from the covered pools that suggested the presence of creatures far too large to fit within the physical constraints of human-designed swimming facilities. Splashing that sent waves high enough to disturb the tarps covering the pools. Deep, resonant calls that sounded like whale songs transmitted through water that couldn't possibly be deep enough to accommodate marine mammals of any significant size. The most unsettling discovery came during the spring of my 7th year as caretaker. I was conducting routine maintenance on the pool covering systems when I noticed that several of the tarps had developed holes that appeared to be deliberately cut rather than torn by weather or wear. The edges were too clean and precise to be accidental damage, and the holes were positioned in patterns that suggested they'd been created by something with enough intelligence to understand the function of the covers and deliberately compromise their integrity. When I investigated further, I found that the holes provided perfect vantage points for observing the pool interiors from above, as if something had been studying the underwater environments and needed better access to whatever was living beneath the surface. I started carrying a camera during my rounds, hoping to document some of the phenomena I'd been witnessing for potential analysis by experts who might be able to explain what was happening at Neptune's kingdom. But electronic equipment seemed to malfunction whenever I attempted to record anything unusual. Batteries would drain instantly when pointed at areas of high activity. Memory cards would corrupt, leaving nothing but static or impossible images that looked like photography errors rather than documentation of actual events. On one occasion, my camera actually caught fire in my hands when I tried to photograph something moving beneath the tarp covering the Kraken's pool, leaving me with minor burns and no evidence of what I'd been trying to capture. The isolation was becoming harder to bear as the years passed. My contact with the outside world had dwindled to occasional supply deliveries and the monthly visits from government officials who would conduct brief inspections and file reports I was never allowed to read. Friends from my time as a regular employee had moved on with their lives, pursuing careers and relationships that seemed impossibly distant from my existence as the guardian of an abandoned water park filled with things that shouldn't exist. I'd grown older, but felt somehow disconnected from the aging process, as if time moved differently within the boundaries of Neptune's kingdom than it did in the world beyond the security fence. The dreams started during my 10th year as caretaker, vivid nightmares that felt more like memories of experiences I'd never actually had. I would find myself swimming through vast underwater spaces that bore no resemblance to any of the pools at Neptune's kingdom, navigating through kelp forests and coral formations that belonged in ocean environments rather than chlorinated recreational facilities. In these dreams, I was always being pursued by something massive and ancient that moved through the water with predatory grace, always just beyond the edge of my vision, but close enough that I could feel the displacement of water as it passed nearby. The most disturbing aspect of these dreams was how they seemed to be teaching me things about Neptune's kingdom that I'd never consciously learned. I would wake up with knowledge of hidden passages beneath the park that connected the various pools in an underground network I'd never seen mapped in any architectural plans. I knew the locations of drainage systems that extended far beyond what should have been necessary for a facility of the park's size, tunnels that seemed to connect not just to municipal water systems, but to natural underground water sources that predated the construction of the park by geological epochs. Acting on information from these dreams, I began exploring areas of Neptune's kingdom that had been off-limits during my tenure as caretaker. Using maintenance keys that I'd never been told I possessed, I gained access to underground service areas that contained equipment I couldn't identify and control systems that seemed to be monitoring conditions in pools that weren't supposed to exist. The readings on these mysterious instruments suggested water temperatures, pressure levels, and chemical compositions that were completely inconsistent with what I observed during my surface-level inspections of the park's facilities. The underground areas were extensive, far more complex than anything that should have been necessary to support the operation of a water park. Tunnels branched off in directions that led away from the main facility, extending into areas that would have been outside the property boundaries if my understanding of the park's layout was accurate. Some passages were filled with water that flowed with enough current to suggest connection to underground rivers or aquifers that could transport materials across vast distances. The sound of moving water echoed from depths that seemed to extend far below the bedrock that was supposed to be the foundation for the entire facility. Following one of the water-filled tunnels led me to a discovery that fundamentally changed my understanding of what Neptune's kingdom had become during its years of abandonment. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber that contained a pool so large I couldn't see its far edges, even with my most powerful flashlight. The water was different here, darker and more viscous than anything I'd encountered in the surface pools, with a mineral content that left a metallic taste in the air. But it was the shapes moving beneath the surface that convinced me I was no longer dealing with anything that could be explained through conventional understanding of marine biology or aquatic ecosystems. The creatures inhabiting this hidden pool were enormous, their forms visible only as shadows that blocked out sections of the underwater lighting that seemed to emanate from sources I couldn't identify. They moved with deliberate purpose, following patrol patterns that suggested territorial behavior and complex social organization. When they surfaced briefly to breathe or communicate, I caught glimpses of anatomical features that belonged to no species I'd ever seen documented in marine biology texts. Appendages that seemed to serve multiple functions, sensory organs that responded to stimuli I couldn't detect, and most disturbing of all, what appeared to be artificial modifications or enhancements that suggested technological sophistication far beyond what should have been possible for purely biological entities. The realization that Neptune's kingdom had been built on top of something that existed long before the first human settlement in the area was simultaneously fascinating and terrifying. The water park hadn't been contaminated or invaded by unknown species. It had been constructed directly over a habitat that contained life forms so advanced and alien that their mere presence had gradually transformed the artificial pools into extensions of their natural environment. Every accident, every equipment malfunction, every inexplicable incident during the park's operational years had been the result of contact between human-designed recreational facilities and an ecosystem that operated according to principles that human science had never encountered. Understanding the true nature of my situation should have prompted an immediate decision to evacuate and seek help from authorities who might be equipped to deal with the discovery. But by that point in my tenure as caretaker, I'd become so integrated into the ecosystem of Neptune's kingdom that leaving felt both impossible and undesirable. The creatures inhabiting the underground pool had become aware of my presence during my exploration information, and rather than reacting with hostility, they seemed to regard me as a beneficial addition to their environment. My role had evolved from security guard to symbiotic partner, helping to maintain conditions that supported their continued existence, while they protected me from external threats that might disrupt the delicate balance we'd achieved. The government officials who conducted monthly inspections were clearly aware that Neptune's kingdom contained anomalous phenomena that required ongoing monitoring, but their interest seemed focused on containment rather than understanding, ensuring that whatever existed within the park's boundaries remained isolated from the general population. My reports had become increasingly honest over the years, documenting encounters and observations that should have prompted immediate intervention. Instead, my candid descriptions of impossible creatures and physics-defying phenomena were apparently filed away without investigation, as if confirming the presence of the unknown was sufficient for their purposes. The arrangement suited everyone involved, including the entities that had made Neptune's kingdom their home. They had no interest in expanding their territory beyond the park's boundaries, content to maintain their hidden civilization in the extensive aquatic environment that had grown beneath and around the original water park. I provided a useful interface between their world and the human authorities who preferred to maintain ignorance about things they couldn't control or understand. In return, they offered protection, companionship of a sort, and access to knowledge about the nature of reality that human science was centuries away from discovering independently. My aging process had slowed dramatically since establishing regular contact with the underground pool. Whether this was a deliberate gift from its inhabitants or a side effect of prolonged exposure to their environment, I couldn't determine, but I felt healthier and more mentally alert than I had in decades, despite spending more than 20 years in a job that should have been physically and psychologically exhausting. The isolation that had once threatened my sanity had been replaced by a sense of purpose and belonging that I'd never experienced during my previous life in human society. The dreams had evolved into something more like shared memory, allowing me to experience fragments of the vast history that the underwater civilization had accumulated over millennia of existence. I learned about their origins in deep ocean trenches, their gradual migration into freshwater systems as geological changes altered the landscape, and their eventual adaptation to the artificial environments created by human industrial activity. Neptune's kingdom wasn't their first encounter with human-built water systems, but it was one of the few locations where the relationship had developed into something approaching cooperation rather than conflict. Through these shared experiences, I began to understand that the creatures weren't malevolent, merely indifferent to human concerns that didn't directly affect their survival and prosperity. The accidents and incidents that had plagued Neptune's kingdom during its operational years hadn't been deliberate attacks on human visitors. They were simply the inevitable result of two incompatible forms of life, attempting to occupy the same space without understanding each other's needs and limitations. The transformation of the park into something that better suited their requirements had been a practical adaptation rather than a hostile takeover. My role as caretaker had become something closer to ambassador, facilitating communication between the underground civilization and the government agencies that monitored the site. The monthly inspections had evolved into information exchanges where I would brief officials about activity levels and environmental changes while they updated me about external developments that might affect the park's isolation. It wasn't an ideal arrangement, but it maintained the stability that all parties seemed to prefer over the uncertainty that would result from more direct contact. The children who occasionally broke into the park posed the most significant challenge to this delicate balance. Urban explorers and thrill seekers were drawn to Neptune's kingdom by its reputation as a haunted location, arriving with cameras and live streaming equipment to document their adventures in the abandoned water park. Most of these intruders could be discouraged through conventional security measures, but some were determined enough to penetrate deep into the facility where they risked encountering phenomena they weren't prepared to understand. The college students who'd arrived last month with professional filming equipment represented the most serious breach of security I'd dealt with in years. They'd researched the park extensively, timing their arrival to avoid my routine patrols and bringing tools that allowed them to bypass the improved fencing systems that had been installed to keep casual trespassers away. Their plan was to create documentary content about urban decay and abandoned amusement facilities, but their presence had triggered defensive responses from the underwater civilization that threatened to expose secrets that needed to remain hidden. I'd found their abandoned equipment scattered around the main pool complex, expensive cameras and sound recording devices that suggested they'd been documenting everything they encountered before something forced them to abandon their project. Reviewing their footage revealed several hours of exploration through areas of the park that were supposed to be inaccessible to unauthorized personnel. They'd managed to find entrances to the underground tunnel system, and their recordings showed clear evidence of the creatures that inhabited the hidden pools beneath Neptune's kingdom's public areas. The final minutes of their footage showed the college students trapped in one of the deepest areas of the underground complex, surrounded by water that seemed to respond to their presence with hostile intent. The footage was chaotic and difficult to interpret, but it was clear that they'd encountered something that fundamentally challenged their understanding of what was possible in an abandoned water park. Their terrified reactions and increasingly desperate attempts to escape suggested they'd realized that Neptune's kingdom contained dangers far beyond the structural hazards typically associated with derelict facilities. I'd found only one survivor from the group, a young woman who'd managed to reach the surface of the main pool complex, but remained catatonic for hours afterward. When she finally regained the ability to speak, she could only repeat fragments of what she'd experienced in the underwater chambers. Descriptions of vast spaces filled with impossible architecture and creatures that defied biological classification. The paramedics who'd responded to my emergency call had sedated her before transporting her to a facility that specialized in trauma cases, but I doubted she would ever fully recover from exposure to realities that human minds weren't equipped to process. The incident had prompted increased scrutiny from the government agencies that monitored Neptune's kingdom, along with upgrades to security systems that made future breaches less likely. But it had also demonstrated that the delicate balance we'd maintained for more than 2 decades was becoming increasingly fragile as curiosity about the abandoned park grew among people who had no understanding of what they might encounter. The urban exploration community was sharing information about successful penetrations of the facility, encouraging more adventurous individuals to attempt their own investigations of the mysterious water park that refused to be demolished or forgotten. My reports about the college student incident had generated more interest from my government contacts than any communication I'd submitted in years. For the first time since accepting my position as caretaker, I was receiving direct instructions about how to handle my responsibilities rather than being left to develop my own protocols for managing the site. The new guidelines emphasized containment above all else, authorizing me to use any means necessary to prevent unauthorized access to the underground areas where the most sensitive phenomena occurred. But the increased oversight came with resources that finally allowed me to properly maintain the facility as something more than a deteriorating monument to failed recreational development. New equipment arrived monthly, tools and technologies that seemed far more advanced than anything typically associated with site security or environmental monitoring. Some of the devices were clearly designed to detect and track biological entities that didn't conform to conventional understanding of marine life, while others appeared to be communication systems that could facilitate contact with intelligence that didn't rely on traditional speech or written language. The most significant upgrade was the installation of barriers that could prevent unauthorized access to the underground areas without interfering with the normal activities of the creatures that inhabited the hidden pools. The technology involved seemed to create selective permeability fields that would allow passage for entities that met certain criteria while repelling those that posed potential security risks. I wasn't given technical specifications for how these systems functioned, but their effectiveness was immediately apparent when casual trespassers began reporting that certain areas of the park seemed to be surrounded by invisible walls that prevented further exploration. Working with these advanced security systems had given me access to monitoring data that revealed the true extent of the underground civilization that had made Neptune's kingdom their home. The network of connected pools and tunnels extended for miles beneath the surrounding landscape, connecting to natural water systems that reached the Great Lakes and potentially extended to ocean environments thousands of miles away. The entities inhabiting this vast aquatic complex had developed technologies that allowed them to manipulate water pressure, temperature, and chemistry in ways that created perfect environmental conditions for their continued existence and expansion. Their level of organization was far more sophisticated than I'd previously understood. The creatures I'd been observing weren't simply large marine animals that had adapted to artificial pools. They were members of a complex society with hierarchical structures, specialized roles, and collective decision-making processes that governed their interactions with both their environment and the human world above. My role as caretaker was apparently the result of negotiations conducted at levels of their society that I'd never directly encountered, diplomatic arrangements that had taken years to establish and implement. Understanding my true position in this relationship had profound implications for how I viewed my future at Neptune's kingdom. I wasn't simply a security guard who'd stumbled into an unusual situation and decided to make the best of it. I was a deliberately selected representative of human civilization who'd been evaluated, tested, and eventually accepted as a suitable interface between two incompatible forms of intelligent life. My decades of service hadn't been spent in isolation guarding an abandoned facility. They'd been an extended apprenticeship in interspecies diplomacy, conducted under conditions that protected both sides from the misunderstandings that had historically characterized contact between humans and non-human intelligence. The realization that I'd been chosen rather than trapped changed my perspective on everything I'd experienced during my tenure as caretaker. The accidents and phenomena that had initially frightened me had been tests designed to evaluate my psychological stability and adaptability. The gradual escalation of contact with the underground civilization had been a carefully orchestrated introduction process that allowed both sides to develop trust and understanding without triggering defensive responses that could have resulted in conflict. Even my physical and mental health improvements were apparently the result of deliberate interventions designed to ensure my continued effectiveness in a role that required longevity and resilience that normal human biology couldn't provide. But with understanding came responsibility that extended far beyond the simple caretaking duties I'd originally accepted. The government agencies that monitored Neptune's kingdom were apparently part of a larger organization that dealt with anomalous phenomena throughout the world, and my success in establishing peaceful relations with the underwater civilization had identified me as someone suitable for similar assignments elsewhere. They were offering me opportunities to expand my role, traveling to other locations where contact with non-human intelligence required representatives who understood the complexities of interspecies diplomacy. The decision wasn't easy. Neptune's kingdom had become my home in ways that went beyond simple familiarity or comfort with routine. The relationships I'd developed with the entities inhabiting the underground pools represented the most meaningful connections I'd experienced since losing Rebecca all those decades ago. Leaving would mean abandoning friends and allies who'd protected and supported me through the most challenging period of my life. Trading assume known relationships for uncertainties that might not offer the same sense of belonging and purpose. But staying meant accepting that my future would always be defined by decisions made during my youth. When I'd been too naive to understand the implications of accepting a simple caretaking job at an abandoned water park, the world beyond Neptune's kingdom had continued evolving while I'd been learning to communicate with aquatic entities and maintain facilities that operated according to physics I couldn't entirely comprehend. Rejoining human society would require adaptations that might be even more challenging than learning to coexist with creatures from the depths of underground pools. The choice was ultimately made for me by the entities themselves. During one of our regular communication sessions, they made it clear that my role at Neptune's kingdom had always been intended as preparation for larger responsibilities rather than a permanent assignment. They'd been sharing information about human civilization with their counterparts at other locations, and the consensus was that expanded contact would be beneficial for both species if conducted through representatives who understood the requirements for successful interspecies cooperation. My replacement arrived last week, a young woman with a background in marine biology and linguistics who'd apparently been recruited through the same careful selection process I'd undergone decades earlier without realizing it. She'd been briefed about the true nature of Neptune's kingdom and seemed genuinely excited about the opportunity to establish contact with an advanced aquatic civilization. Her enthusiasm reminded me of my own feelings during the early days of my tenure, before I'd understood the weight of responsibility that came with serving as humanity's representative to intelligences that viewed our species as barely evolved beyond primitive tribalism. Training my successor required sharing knowledge that I'd never been able to discuss with anyone who could truly understand its implications. I found myself describing creature behaviors and environmental conditions that sounded like fantasy, even to someone who'd been prepared for contact with non-human intelligence. The depth and complexity of the underwater civilization was something that could only be appreciated through years of direct experience, and I worried that my replacement wouldn't develop the intuitive understanding necessary for effective communication before encountering situations that required immediate and accurate responses. But the entities themselves seemed confident in their choice of my successor, and their judgment had proven reliable throughout our relationship. They demonstrated remarkable insight into human psychology and behavior, accurately predicting how various individuals would react to contact with phenomena that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. If they believed my replacement was suitable for the role, she probably possessed qualities that would allow her to succeed, even if her approach differed significantly from the methods I'd developed through trial and error. My final week at Neptune's kingdom was spent documenting everything I could remember about the facility's transformation over the past 25 years, creating a record that might help my successor avoid the mistakes and misunderstandings that had characterized my early tenure as caretaker. The process of reviewing my experiences forced me to confront how much I'd changed during my time at the park, the ways in which prolonged contact with non-human intelligence had altered my fundamental assumptions about consciousness, communication, and the nature of existence itself. I was no longer the frightened teenager who'd accepted a simple security job at an abandoned water park, nor was I the confused young man who'd spent years trying to rationalize phenomena that couldn't be explained through conventional understanding of physics and biology. I'd become something new, a hybrid form of consciousness that could function effectively in both human society and the aquatic civilization that had adopted me as their representative to the surface world. The knowledge and abilities I'd gained during my transformation would allow me to serve as a bridge between species that had previously existed in complete isolation from each other. Tomorrow, I leave Neptune's kingdom for the first time in 25 years, beginning a new chapter of my life that will involve travel to locations where similar contact situations are developing between human and non-human intelligence. The work will be challenging and potentially dangerous, but it offers opportunities for discovery and understanding that didn't exist when I first accepted employment at a small-town water park that seemed like a temporary solution to my lack of direction and ambition. As I write this final entry in the journal I've kept throughout my tenure as caretaker, the creatures in the underground pools are gathering for what appears to be a farewell ceremony that acknowledges my transition from student to colleague in the ongoing project of establishing peaceful relations between incompatible forms of life. The water throughout the facility is glowing with bioluminescent displays that create patterns of impossible beauty, a gift from friends I'll probably never see again, but will remember for the rest of my extended existence. Neptune's kingdom taught me that reality is far more complex and mysterious than human science has ever imagined, filled with intelligence and consciousness that operates according to principles we're only beginning to understand. The abandoned water park, where I spent my youth learning to communicate with entities from another world, will continue serving as a training ground for the representatives who will be needed as contact between species becomes more frequent and inevitable. But for me, it will always be the place where I discovered that love and friendship can transcend the boundaries that separate different forms of life, where an uncertain teenager found purpose and meaning that justified decades of sacrifice and isolation. Rebecca Chen and her funnel cake smile belong to a past that feels like it happened to someone else, but the connections I've formed with the creatures of the deep pools are permanent bonds that will influence every decision I make during whatever adventures await me in the wider world of interspecies diplomacy. The water is calling, and I'm finally ready to answer. Thanks for surviving this story. If you want more nightmares to keep you up at night, hit that sub button and leave a comment. This helps me a lot.